In the spring of 1944, German intelligence officers in Berlin gathered around a conference table covered with photographs, intercepted communications, and reconnaissance reports. They weren't tracking Allied troop movements or supply shipments. They were tracking one man. His name was George S. Patton, and the Germans were desperate to know where he would appear next. For months, German High Command had devoted more intelligence resources to tracking Patton than any other Allied commander. Not Eisenhower, who ran the entire Allied operation. Not Montgomery, who had chased Rommel across North Africa. One American general consumed German intelligence like no other. Field Marshal George von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in Western Europe, monitored Patton's movements closely. Any information about his location was considered high-priority intelligence. Rundstedt had fought the best generals the Allies had to offer, but Patton was different. Patton terrified him. The Germans first encountered Patton in November 1942 during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Patton commanded the Western Task Force, landing 35,000 American troops on the coast of Morocco. It was America's first major ground operation against Axis forces in the war. German commanders paid close attention. They always studied enemy generals, looking for patterns, weaknesses, tendencies they could exploit. What they saw in Patton troubled them immediately. He moved fast, faster than American commanders were supposed to move. The U.S. Army was known for methodical, careful advances with overwhelming firepower. Patton didn't fight like that. Within 3 days, he had secured Casablanca and accepted the French surrender. His troops covered ground at a pace that caught German observers completely off guard. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the Mediterranean, requested detailed intelligence on this American general. Who was he? What was his background? How did he think? The reports came back with information that made German commanders deeply uncomfortable. Patton had spent his entire career studying German military tactics. He read German military theory in the original language. He had visited French battlefields from World War I and walked the ground where German armies had nearly broken through. He understood German operational thinking better than most German officers. In February 1943, German forces under Rommel launched an offensive at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The attack smashed through American lines and sent inexperienced U.S. troops fleeing in panic. It was the worst defeat American forces would suffer in the entire war. The Germans watched with interest to see how the Americans would respond. Would they retreat? Would they replace their commanders? Would they lose their nerve entirely? The answer arrived in early March. George Patton took command of 2nd Corps, the shattered American force that had collapsed at Kasserine. What happened next stunned German intelligence officers monitoring the front. Within 2 weeks, Patton had transformed 2nd Corps. The same soldiers who had fled in panic were now attacking. Discipline was restored. Morale was rebuilt. Units that had been combat ineffective were suddenly aggressive. German reconnaissance reported American patrols probing their lines with a new ferocity they hadn't seen before. Rommel himself took notice. In his diary, he wrote that American forces had suddenly become far more dangerous. The change was too rapid to be explained by reinforcements or new equipment. Something else had happened. Someone new was in command. July 1943. The Allies invaded Sicily, the stepping stone to mainland Italy. The plan called for Montgomery's British 8th Army to take the lead, driving up the eastern coast toward Messina, while Patton's 7th Army protected his flank. Patton had other ideas. He drove his forces across the western half of Sicily at a pace that astonished everyone, including his own commanders. His troops covered more ground in less time than any Allied force had managed in the entire war. German forces, trying to evacuate across the Strait of Messina, found themselves in a race they hadn't anticipated. Patton was pushing so hard that their escape route was threatened. Units that expected days to withdraw found themselves with hours. The evacuation became chaotic, with German commanders desperately trying to get their men out before Patton cut them off. When Patton reached Messina, he arrived before Montgomery despite starting further away. He had covered 200 miles in 39 days, fighting all the way. German after-action reports described the campaign with a mixture of professional admiration and genuine alarm. One German officer wrote that Patton fought like a panzer commander, not an American infantry general. He took risks that American doctrine didn't allow. He exploited weaknesses before defenders could react. He thought like a German. That was exactly what scared them. August 1943. At the height of his success, Patton visited 2 evacuation hospitals in Sicily. What happened there nearly destroyed his career and handed the Germans an unexpected gift. Patton encountered soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. In his view, they were cowards who had abandoned their comrades. He slapped one soldier across the face. A week later, he slapped another, this time pulling his pistol and threatening to shoot the man. Word of the incidents reached Eisenhower, who was furious. The story leaked to the press. Suddenly, the general, who had just won a brilliant campaign, was facing calls for his removal. Congressmen demanded he be sent home in disgrace. Newspapers ran editorials calling him unfit for command. German intelligence monitored the controversy with great interest. They had identified Patton as the most dangerous American commander. Now the Americans might remove him themselves. German officers couldn't quite believe their luck. But Eisenhower didn't fire Patton. He reprimanded him severely and kept him in place. The Germans noted this decision with concern. The Americans clearly valued Patton despite the scandal. That meant they were probably saving him for something important. By early 1944, Patton had been removed from combat command. He was in England, waiting. The Germans tracked his movements obsessively. They knew he was there. They knew he wasn't commanding any of the forces that would obviously participate in the coming invasion. So what was he doing? German intelligence concluded that Patton must be commanding the main invasion force. It made perfect sense. The Americans wouldn't waste their best general on a secondary operation. Whatever Patton was leading would be the real attack. What the Germans didn't know was that the 1st United States Army Group was a ghost. It existed on paper and in radio signals. It had tanks made of inflatable rubber. Its headquarters buildings were painted plywood. Its massive invasion force existed entirely in German imagination. It was the greatest deception operation of the war. And it only worked because the Germans believed that wherever Patton was, that's where the main attack would come. The German High Command became convinced that the 1st United States Army Group would land at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing point across the English Channel. They positioned their best reserves there. They built their strongest defenses there. They waited for Patton there. June 6, 1944. Allied forces landed at Normandy, 150 miles southwest of Pas-de-Calais. The invasion Hitler had been expecting for years had finally arrived. But German commanders hesitated. Was this the real invasion? Or was this a diversion meant to draw their reserves south before Patton struck at Pas-de-Calais with the main force? Field Marshal Rundstedt wanted to release the panzer reserves immediately, to push the Allies back into the sea. But the order never came. Hitler and his staff believed the Normandy landing might be a feint. The real attack, led by Patton, could come any day at Calais. For 6 critical weeks, German armored divisions sat near Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an attack that would never come. The divisions that could have crushed the Normandy beachhead in its first vulnerable days remained frozen in place. Because of one man. Because the Germans couldn't believe the Americans would leave George Patton out of the most important battle of the war. August 1st, 1944. Patton finally received a combat command. He took control of the Third Army and entered the fighting in Normandy. The Germans had been waiting for him. Now he was here. And he was about to prove every fear they had about him was justified. In the first 2 weeks of August, Third Army covered more ground than any Allied force had managed in 2 months of fighting. Patton's divisions raced through Brittany, then swung east toward Paris. German units that had held defensive lines for weeks suddenly found Americans behind them, cutting their supply routes, threatening their headquarters. The German command structure in western France collapsed. Units lost contact with their headquarters. Orders contradicted each other. Commanders didn't know where the front was because Patton kept moving it. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced Rundstedt as the senior German commander in the West, sent increasingly desperate reports to Berlin. The American Third Army was everywhere. Every time German forces tried to establish a defensive line, Patton was already past it. The situation was out of control. By mid-August, Patton saw an opportunity that could end the war in France in a single stroke. German armies were retreating through a narrow gap near the town of Falaise. If Allied forces could close that gap, they would trap hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Patton pushed north toward Falaise, while Canadian and Polish forces pushed south. The pocket tightened. German units inside began to panic. Soldiers abandoned their vehicles and tried to escape on foot. Officers lost control of their men. The destruction was catastrophic. German losses in the Falaise pocket exceeded 50,000 captured and perhaps 10,000 killed. Equipment losses were even more devastating. The German army in France lost most of its tanks, artillery, and transport. German officers who survived the pocket later described it as worse than Stalingrad. At least at Stalingrad, they said. There was time to prepare. Patton gave them no time at all. After the war, Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German generals extensively. They asked about Allied commanders. Which ones did you respect? Which ones did you fear? The answers were remarkably consistent. Montgomery was predictable, the German said. He was methodical and careful. You always knew what he would do next. That made him easier to fight. Bradley was competent, but cautious. He didn't take risks. German commanders could anticipate his movements and prepare defenses accordingly. But Patton was different. German generals used words like unpredictable, aggressive, and dangerous. Field Marshal Rundstedt said Patton was the Allied general they most feared. General Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, said Patton was the only Allied commander who had the instincts of a German panzer leader. The Germans respected Rommel because he was bold and unconventional. They found those same qualities in Patton. He didn't fight by the book. He made decisions faster than his opponents could react. He understood that war was about speed and shock and violence, not careful planning and overwhelming force. Rundstedt put it simply. Patton, he said, was the most dangerous man they faced. December 1944. Germany launched its last major offensive of the war. A massive attack through the Ardennes forest that caught Allied commanders completely by surprise. Within days, American forces were in retreat. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne. The situation was desperate. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun. He asked his commanders how quickly they could counterattack. Most generals talked about weeks of preparation. Moving armies was complicated. They needed time. Patton said 48 hours. He could attack in 2 days with 3 divisions. The other generals thought he was grandstanding. It was impossible. You couldn't turn an army 90 degrees and attack on a completely different axis in 48 hours. The logistics alone would take weeks. But Patton had already prepared. His intelligence officer, Oskar Koch, had predicted the German attack when everyone else dismissed the possibility. Patton had quietly developed contingency plans. When the attack came, he was ready. Patton made one phone call. Within hours, Third Army began its pivot north. More than 250,000 men, tens of thousands of vehicles, in winter conditions, across icy roads, in 48 hours. The Germans couldn't believe it. They had expected weeks before any serious counterattack. Instead, Patton was already hitting their southern flank. The relief of Bastogne came on December 26th. The offensive, that was supposed to split the Allied armies, was stopped. After the war, German generals were asked about the Battle of the Bulge. What went wrong? Many of them gave the same answer. They hadn't expected Patton to respond so fast. They thought they had more time. They never learned. From the first day they encountered him in North Africa to the last day of the war, the Germans underestimated how fast Patton could move. And every time, they paid for it. So why did German generals fear Patton more than any other Allied commander? Because he thought like them. German military doctrine emphasized speed, aggression, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses. The blitzkrieg that conquered Poland, France, and nearly Russia was built on these principles. German commanders understood this kind of warfare instinctively. Patton understood it too. He had studied German tactics for decades. He had internalized their philosophy of war. When he commanded an army, he fought the way German generals wished they could fight. But there was something else. German commanders could predict what most Allied generals would do. They knew the American and British military systems. They understood the doctrine, the caution, the reliance on overwhelming firepower before advancing. Patton didn't follow the rules. He attacked when doctrine said to defend. He advanced when logistics said to halt. He took risks that his superiors considered reckless and his enemies considered terrifying. The Germans never knew what Patton would do next. They only knew it would be fast, it would be violent, and it would cost them. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the man who had commanded German forces on D-Day, who had fought the best generals the Allies had to offer, summarized it after the war. Patton, he said, was the supreme master of mobile warfare. He was a brilliant practitioner of offensive tactics, and he was the Allied general the Germans feared the most. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of the Ardennes, George Patton earned that fear. One battle at a time, one impossible victory at a time, until the German generals who had conquered Europe learned what it felt like to face a commander who fought exactly like they did. Only better.